Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us. I am Jeev Chugh, and I head the business agility practice at UST for UK and Europe. We are a team of 200 plus agilists supporting large organizations to transform their business and embrace agility. Today, I am going to start with narrating the story of a wildebeest and a zebra in the Masai Mara region. My favorite holiday destination. If you haven't been there, highly recommend it. So, I'm sure a lot of you might already know that every year millions of wildebeest and zebra have to migrate through the crocodile-infested Mara River. And as part of that, they'll end up losing a lot of their friends to crocodiles. So this year, the leader of the zebra pack and wildebeest pack decide they want to do something different. They get into a bit of a ideation session. If they can come up with some sort of creative idea how they can safely navigate through the river, avoiding all the crocodiles. Think, unable to come up with any good idea. They're like, there are plenty of clever animals in the jungle. Let's seek out some help from them. And as it happens, while they are strolling around, gallivanting around in the jungle, they see a lion sitting under the tree. And they're like, oh, this guy is really smart. He's the king of the jungle. I'm sure he can help us. So they get near the lion. Well, not too close. It's never a good idea to get too close to the lion, but just managing the safe distance. And ask the lion if he can really help us find a safer route to navigate the river. As it happens, lion is in a really good mood today. He's just had a whole day of a supper, and he's like, I must help these guys. The less for crocodile means more of them for me. So he decides to help them, and he's like, I've got a really good idea. Why don't you make a bridge over the river? Then you don't have to swim through it. The zebra looks at the wildebeest. They're like, it's actually a good idea. But they have a conversation between themselves. If either of them have any bridge-making skills. Turns out they don't. So they ask the lion, your idea is great, but how do we actually make a bridge? Lion looks at them with a cheeky smile, says, I do strategy, I don't do execution. And that, folks, is the context of my talk today. When we actually create these artificial boundaries between strategic alignment, between strategy formulation and strategy execution, it most certainly leads to confusion, most certainly leads to misalignment. So, what do we mean by misalignment? Now, when typically the operational activities of an organization, they don't really align with the strategic goals and outcomes, it most certainly leads to misalignment. And you see that organizations are built up of large, landscape of silos. The silos could be born out of skills, geographical units, functional units, and so on. When we are translating the strategy, for these silos, in my experience, I've seen that a lot of context is actually lost. And it gets really difficult to understand how the efforts of these silos really fit into the bigger picture. I don't know if you've seen that in your organizations. I see that a lot. And what typically I notice then is there's a big execution gap because you really don't understand how the efforts fit into the bigger picture. And the organizations then typically tend to have a headless chicken syndrome. What I mean by that is there's plenty of work actually happening in the organization, plenty of random movements, but really without a North Star guiding on the outcomes, very little value is actually being delivered. And if you take away the value, what is the real purpose of delivering faster? It's like, oh yes, we're really maximizing the production speed for this product, but no one really wants to buy that product. It just doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, when you have strategic alignment, the entire organization really unites on accomplishing that strategic goals and the outcomes. You see that everyone really starts to understand the purpose of their roles and responsibilities. And that's where you see the real value being delivered. Now you're not a headless chicken anymore, but you're the goose that lays the golden eggs. And I'm sure we all want to be that goose and not the chicken. Moving on. Now, there is a massive cost to strategic misalignment. And it's not just me saying. I'm sure you might have read already, but there's a lot of industry research published in this space, right? From the likes of PMI, Gartner, McKinsey, Forbes. I've put together a few numbers here. At a glance, you might think they're quite random numbers from different researchers. But the reality is, this is actually a sequence of dominoes. I'll say it's actually a tale of catastrophes. For example, if you look at what MIT Sloan suggests, that alignment plummets from the top execs and their direct reports from 51% to 22%. Now, it's pretty low to begin with. 51% isn't great. And it starts to get negligible a layer below. No wonder then Forbes suggests that 90% of the organizations are actually failing to execute on strategy. And then Gartner suggesting that 70% don't even have the confidence in how to reduce that gap. Clearly, there's going to be a cost to that, right? And you can see predictive index, McKinsey, they're suggesting significant cost to it in terms of 25% of the revenue. So, and that's why I say this is actually telling us a tale of catastrophe. Moving on, now strategic misalignment can actually, Now, misalignment typically happens, can happen quite, I've seen that it happens very silently. A lot of times organizations don't even realize that they have misalignment. So what I did, I put together some symptoms, typically how we can actually spot misalignment, that I've actually seen in some of the recent engagements, where we can actually, that help the organization to spot misalignment. Because if you can actually spot it early on, you can quickly course correct it. One of the symptoms that and also what we typically see is that the misalignment happens not because of the weakness in the strategy itself. I see it mostly happening because the organizations are failing to manage that continuous alignment. I see that continuous is the real key here, where they're not able to manage that. So let's take a look at some of the symptoms that I was talking about. Now, I'm sure everyone has seen that unsustainable amount of work coming into the system. We've all probably seen somewhere in our careers. Typically, that means that your employees end up working hand to mouth. It can really lower their engagement. It can have a significant impact on the company's culture, erodes that, and eventually the overall performance. And this is not often because of prioritization. It's more often because of actually the organization has strategic misalignment. Because if you do have alignment, it's very quickly, you can understand and what's value and what are the non-value add activities. However, if this work is coming from multiple sources and you've got misalignment, pretty much everything is considered important and you're overcommitting yourself there. And then the organizations you see quickly start, their growth tends to stall, they are struggling to innovate. So it's very common to see some of these symptoms when organizations have misalignment. Another one that I see a lot is when we see technology and business relationships are very transactional. Typically, when there is this adversarial relationship, I've always seen there's a misalignment of purpose. Now, I mentioned earlier that we can't really have these artificial boundaries between strategy formulation and strategy execution. Exactly that. When you have, when you create your business strategy, your technology strategy has to be integrated from the very early on. You cannot create your technology strategy separately and then align to that. That most certainly leads to misalignment. And your business is never going to have the confidence that your investments are actually committed to strategic priorities. We see that a lot in the organizations where they've undergone some agile transformations as well, but very much in the technology functions. The business is still working in the siloed mode with a traditional mindset, command and control manner. You see the product rollouts are consistently getting delayed as well because the business initiatives actually to launch them, which are happening in silo, are just not aligned. So like I said, it's not an exhaustive list, but just some of the symptoms that I've seen in some of the recent engagements. Moving on. Now, misalignment can be extremely painful and frustrating for the C-suites because it really impedes their ability to respond to change quickly and decisively. And whilst I see that they have been slowly realizing that over the years, it's very recently because of the economic shocks of the pandemic, I think a lot of them have had that wake-up call. One such engagement I'd like to talk about, for the sake of this conversation, I've anonymized it and we're calling it Acme Natural. I was with the CEO of a large retail organization. I had a quick conversation with him back in 2020. He said, who had a similar awakening thanks to COVID, and was like, we have to quickly adapt our strategy, retail strategy, from bricks to clicks to respond to COVID. Our challenge is we've got about 300 odd projects running in the organization. Very little confidence that the investments are committed to strategic priorities. There's no visibility and traceability. And as part of this strategy change, they have to take some harsh decisions. Which projects keep that funding and which don't? How do we, and they haven't got any objective process to determine that. So how do we decide on that quickly and effectively? Because currently they're finding it, their response to change really slow, and it's creating a lot of waste for them. Now, the focus of this particular engagement for us was very much around how we can enable that strategic alignment quickly for this organization, build that visibility and traceability so they can swiftly respond to the changes, but equally build a long-term process to manage that continuous strategic alignment. And I said process, but that's not really a change in process, right? That requires a change in your leadership behaviors, in people's mindsets, equally in the technology aspect. So that is a significant change in the organization. So whilst we embedded that change in the organization and in some similar organizations in some of the recent engagements, there's been a few lessons learned that I'd really like to share with you all today when we were enabling that strategic agility. Now, lesson number one is very much around how we emphasize, we must emphasize on building a strategy as an iterative hypothesis. It needs to be continuously validated, tested, and adapted. It cannot just be a one-off plan. I still see a lot that CEOs of large organizations, they'll come up with this, an annual off-site event to charter the course for the rest of the year. I'm sure a lot of you have all seen that as well. How grueling and painful that process is. Once complete, no one really wants to revisit that. But it just doesn't work. But the reality is, as soon as you're out of that, your strategy starts to get stale, and now your execution is based on out-of-date assumptions. But the reality is, if the organizations really want to respond to change and frequency, if they really want to respond to change that is happening more than once a year, clearly their strategy must also be adapting at a frequency approximating that pace of change. I've seen that quarterly works well in most organizations, but it could be done monthly if required. So for this particular organization, Acme, we translated their longer-term strategy into quarterly business outcomes, adopting OKRs. I won't get into the detail of that. I'm sure it's a very well understood concept. Hope so. And there's some more talks coming on that. But equally, as part of that, it helped us create a lot of room for agility in the strategy, because at the end of the quarter, as the outcomes are feeding back into the longer-term goals, it helps us evolve our strategy. So you can't have, and this was with an organization, Acme Natural, that had adopted some sort of agile at scale framework in their organization back in 2017. So they had built their delivery engine iteratively and incrementally, but the strategy was still, running on an annual basis. But this allowed us to create that room for agility in strategy. Lesson number 2. Well, I think this one's the most important one that I've learned the hard way, is that focusing on building that cohesive leadership over that power leadership that we see the most. Now, it's very common for leaders to assume that their strategy and plans will naturally align downwards. It will result in a cohesive approach for the reinforcing their top-level goals. That doesn't really happen anywhere. I haven't seen that. For most of the organizations that I've worked with, it's been quite evident that the maximum amount of issues around unity, joint accountability, teamwork is not at the grassroots level. It's at the very top level leadership level. That's where you see a lot of the leaders interpreting their strategy based on how it best fits with their career and business goals. This, to me, is actually a source of a lot of local optimization, and if I must say, willful misalignment. And it does happen a lot. And until we actually course correct the behaviors around our leadership, no change we bring in the organization is going to work, it's going to sustain. It just doesn't. So for me, the first thing to look at is to do a 360-degree analysis of our leaders' alignment. And how do we focus on modeling those right set of behaviors that we get from that? What I am stressing quite here on this picture is that intersection of new ways of thinking and new ways of working. Now, leaders can't just have one or the other. They can't think that they are thinking differently unless they are actually working differently as well. I'll give you a really good example here of Satya Nadella. I think very relevant. 8 years ago, when he took helm at Microsoft, stock was around under 50. Now it's nearly 300. And one of his key emphasis around was for his immediate leadership team to build joint accountability and teamwork. And to do that, he completely revamped the performance management system, incentivized team accountability, joint accountability, teamwork, create shared metrics for all his leaders. And that simple changes at the top level had magnified impact at the grassroots level. It was amazing to see that in action. Lesson number 3. We see this a lot. Real value streams over imitation value streams. Now, value streams are quite hot, right? You're seeing that in a lot of organizations popping up. And that's good. A lot of organizations are trying to kind of move away from the fragmented structures around projects to working in value stream aligned product-centric approaches. But when you take a deeper look in these organizations, these aren't really value streams. They are still working very much in the siloed mode. It's just been more like a checkbox exercise. And why is that? I think one of the main reasons is that they have created these value streams in isolation. The value stream for these organizations, for the nonlinear work that most of these organizations do, the iterative work, they intersect and interact with all the other values, many other value streams. And unless and until you capture those dependencies across value streams, you don't map correctly, you are always going to end up with these imitated value streams. The other thing that we see a lot is, value streams are created based on internal perspective of what the customer value is, rather than actually capturing the customer value. And then you start to misinterpret what value is, and you end up with the false value stream. Even if you get the first two right, now this one I see a lot, organizations always end up doing value stream mapping as part of a one-off exercise of some agile transformation or some transformation, right? But value streams are dynamic. Value streams can change over time. The intersections and interactions can change. The customer perspective of value can change. So you need to be continually inspect and adapt and evolve, improve your value streams. In my experience, I've seen at least annually it works well, if it's done. It could be done more, but at least should be done annually, is what I'd say. And finally, how many of you think that PMOs have a role to play in the agile organization? Anyone can raise your hands? A few. I would have thought more than that. I mean, I think they certainly have a role to play, a very important one. But I think their roles are evolving. You can't have PMOs, just as your box checkers and auditors, but rather you want PMO function to be working as strategic partners of the business, as your servant leaders, as orchestrators to kind of help articulate and measure that business outcome, to continuously validate that strategic alignment. And if you can bring that change in identity for the PMOs, I have seen it can yield phenomenal results for the organization. Certainly did for Acme, and I know for more organizations it has. As part of this new, to make this new identity change clearer, it's quite common to kind of rename them to VMO, VRO, Value Realization Office, whatever works, but I think it's a great idea and must be done. So I think that comes to the end of my talk today. Thank you all. Been a pleasure connecting with you all. If anyone would like to have a further chat on this, you will find me near the UST booth. Cheers. Thanks.